So, today I'll be talking about a concept that I have that I call a perfect art style. So, what do I mean by a perfect art style? So, a perfect art style for me is any art style that can be done to perfection now. Meaning that if it's done to perfection, this art style will never age, because independently of how far in the future you look at the art style, it would always be perceived the exact same way because it was already done to perfection in its concept. So first of all, for the purpose of this video, I'll be restricting the topic a little bit more. Therefore, I will not be talking about 2D art, mostly because I consider that since technology-wise we are no longer restricted by resolution or color palettes, and by the simple fact that to make a 2D game you are already having a layer of abstraction, which therefore stylizes your game. So then, pretty much any 2D art could be considered a perfect art style. So we will be mostly focusing on 3D. And additionally, I will be broadly ignoring lighting, since I will consider that a model that had been done to perfection in the past could simply be imported into a new engine and the new lighting would already shine. No pun intended. So, what are the problems of not using a perfect art style? So the main problem is the fact that, well, art will age. If we've all had this experience, which we remember a game fondly from our childhood, but when we revisit it or look at screenshots of whatever, we realize that they actually look very bad and very aged now. If we look, for example, at games that were quite stylized but technologically couldn't be done to perfection, we look, for example, on Mario 64, which, although the art style is quite stylized, at the time it could not be done to perfection, and therefore nowadays it still looks very old. And the same happened if we look at the first Crash Bandicoot. If you look at it now, it still looks very old. But if, for example, now you look at the remasters of Crash Bandicoot, although the art style itself has not changed, technology now allows it to be done to perfection, and therefore the art style will not age. And if we look at the remasters in 10 or 20 years, we will perceive them the exact same way. Other games that have not aged so well are, for example, the first Far Cry or Tony Hawk Underground, which is, for me, one of those games where I had this issue where coming back to it now, I realized that it didn't look good, but in my memories, I thought it looked very good. So what happened with these two games? One of the things that these two games have in common is that they're going for a quite realistic art style, and one of the main problems of always going for realism is that realism is something that greatly improved with technology, has always been proven to improve year after year, and is one of the art style that ages the worst. Although we have been realizing that it seems as we are reaching a kind of peak in realism, which makes it so that it takes more years for an old realistic game to look aged. Back in the day, with only 1 year difference, a game could start looking old, but nowadays, if we don't look 10 years in the past, games still hold up pretty well. As you can see, for example, in games from 10 years ago like Resident Evil 6, Final Fantasy 13, or Crysis 2 from 2011. Although we can see that they're starting to age a little bit, they honestly still look quite decent. Biggest issues, for example, in Final Fantasy 13 are, for example, the very lack of foliage and objects in the map, and a very bland and flat terrain. And keep in mind that these are franchises that have been known for really reaching the limit of what was possible at the time that they were released. And one of the issues that realism has is that it will always be restricted by performance. Even today, if we try to reach the maximum graphics that we could do, it would probably not run well, and therefore we would have to restrict and limit what we're able to do in order for it to run properly. So now let's look at some examples of old games that, although they are old, still hold up to this day. So first of all, we can take a look at Mario Sunshine, which released for the GameCube, which for the detail, it is simply the next generation after the Nintendo 64. And as you can see, although the art style it is pretty much the same as Mario 64, they were now able to pretty much do it to perfection, which means that even if we look at it now, it still looks pretty good and doesn't seem to have aged too much. Where the main things that can be improved is simply display resolution and, well, texture resolution. But apart from that, the game really holds up. Another game which was also for the GameCube, and that also holds up to this day, is Star Fox Adventures, and again in this case, it would simply greatly benefit from a better display resolution. And again, another game that has an interesting thing, which is Pikmin. This game, when you look at it, when you look at the gameplay characters, like the main character, the Pikmins themselves, the different spaceships and so on, they still holds up to this day, but what you can realize is that all of the background assets and the textures look pretty bad. And, well, what you'll realize is that those things are actually aiming for a realistic art style, while the rest of the game is highly stylized. And here you can clearly see in one game how the parts of it which were realistic did not age so good, while the rest of the model still holds up. And, well, if for example we compare old LEGO games with the newer LEGO games, we can see that a lot of it comes down to lighting. And for example, when looking at LEGO games, you can see that in a lot of cases they seem to simply have added more details to the texture, but it wasn't necessarily something that was not possible at the time of the originals. And if for example you compare the original Wind Waker with the HD version of the game, you can clearly see again that it's simply benefiting from a high resolution display image, and, well, slightly higher resolution textures, and, well, you can also tell a little bit of a difference in lighting. But apart from that, the game pretty much looked the same. And I have been mentioning lighting a little bit, although I said I was going to ignore it, but I wanted to mention that one of the things you could do in order to reduce the impact that lighting can have on your game is having things like cell shading and other types of shadings where you basically decide how you want light to work on your models. And another thing that I have been saying that could improve from past games is texture quality. And one of the cool things is that nowadays texture quality is not that much of an issue anymore. Like, you can have a game with pretty much all textures like 1080p and the game will probably still run correctly. And nowadays games have textures with a lot higher qualities than that. The biggest thing is that now, well, games tend to take a lot more space in your hard drive. So now we looked at old games that had pretty much perfect art style, but what about new games? Well, one of the interesting things about new games is because technology has improved so much, whenever you see things that I would consider perfect art styles, it is usually a very deliberate choice, which is very interesting. So if we look at examples with a very low poly art style, we can look, for example, at Necropolis, which is a roguelike dungeon crawler with a very Dark Souls combat. And this game has a very low polygon art style with very flat textures. This is a very deliberate art style that looks pretty good. And, well, because it is an art style that can be done to perfection, has been done to perfection, and its concept, it's a game that will never age. If you look at this game in 10 or 20 years, the perception of it will be the exact same. Another game that I like to mention when I talk about this topic is Frog Detective. They will now be releasing the third game of the series, and one thing you can realize is that they actually all look the exact same way. Although they've been released with a few years of intervals between them, they look the exact same way, simply because it was a very deliberate art style. Again, they decided to make the game look a certain way, and it was done to perfection at its concept, therefore there is really nothing to improve on it. And although you can see all of the polygons of the models and the characters, it doesn't matter because that is what they're going for. And well, if you look at other games that are going for a not so low poly art style, we can look at, well, Mario Odyssey, which again, it is to some extent the pinnacle of the Mario art style. And this game, if you even compare it to older Mario games like Sunshine, you can see how it mostly improves in textures, resolution, and amount of stuff in the map. But outside of that, the art style is pretty much the same. Although we have to admit that Odyssey looks amazing. Other games that have a not so low poly art style is, for example, Hub, which is an action adventure platformer that has a very stylized art, which I really like. And in this case, it does seem to have some interesting shading. And lastly, I wanted to talk about Valheim, which is, although it is a game that uses very low poly models, it's a game that does something very interesting, which is that they have very low resolution textures on purpose, which in my opinion looks very interesting and actually looks very good. Of course, when you get close to object, you can clearly see the pixels, which doesn't necessarily bother me, but when you end up looking at the game from afar, it looks very nice and very pretty. So now for the devs out there, I would recommend to always try to go for a perfect art style. And although a lot of us are not necessarily very good artists, whenever you're choosing an art style, I would recommend to choose an art style that you know you can consistently do perfectly. So for that, I would recommend not going for an art style that reaches your maximum skill level, but rather go for something slightly lower that ensures that you will be always consistently be able to reach the art style that you're aiming for. And again, don't be afraid of low polygon art styles, or even some weirder things like Valheim's very low resolution textures, or even games without textures whatsoever. And most importantly, be deliberate, meaning that whenever you do something, do it consciously. Choose the way you want it to look and not let it be dictated by performance on other restrictions. If you find yourself in those restrictions, then maybe reconsider your art style and try going for something that will most likely run better. And keep in mind that anytime you're going for a specific art style, it will make it more original, more interesting, and will probably add a lot of character to your game and make it more impactful and memorable. So as a conclusion, I want people to realize the importance of going for a perfect art style. That most likely you can move away from realism, since that is probably going to cause you more issues than are really necessary. Then if you realize that your art style is being now restricted by performance or the other possible issues, maybe rethink the art style instead, which is, I think, better to choose a different art style than to go for a art style that you will not be able to do to its perfection. And well, if you do go for an art style that can be done to perfection, you will be rewarded with an art style that will last the test of time, that will likely add character to your game, and will more likely than not run pretty decently. And well, honestly, I believe that this concept should have been applied in the past as well. I believe that back in the day, we were, of course, a lot more restricted by technology and performance. But even back then, you could probably have thought of an art style that would probably look good with what the technology was capable at the time. I would not have aged as badly. For example, the example of Pikmin is quite interesting. Why did they have to go for realism in the background objects instead of keeping the game more consistent graphically and not have now a part of it which looks very bad? Or games could have gone for more abstract things like just polygons and shapes that, although yes, the game would not have characters per se, but it will still have a very impactful image and it would still look good today. Well, at least would be perceived again the same way that it did back then. Well, I hope that this video motivates people to go for art styles that they can do to perfection and that will make games last the test of time a lot better. And well, if you like the topic and the concept, leave a like, subscribe, and see you next time.